I wanted to talk about the mincha offering that we just read about. This mincha was a grain offering. Now, some of it was burnt on the altar, but the rest of it was eaten by the priests. And the Torah told us in 6, 9, and 10, which we just read, matzot te'achel b'makom kadosh, it shall be eaten as matzah in the holy place. They shall eat it in the courtyard of the tent of meeting. It shall not be baked with chametz, with leaven. Matzah. 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 Now, it's pretty easy to see the connections the rabbis make between this parsha and Pesach, right? The grain offering is baked into matzah, that famous unleavened bit of yumminess. And I bet you thought matzah was just for Pesach, but Leviticus has just told us otherwise. Because here we see that there are actually two contexts in the Torah with the commandment to eat only unleavened bread, Passover, of course, and the temple, like we just read. Now, why matzah instead of regular bread? Well, for Passover, it's pretty clear. Number one, it's a reminder that we had to leave Egypt in great haste at a moment's notice. And, of course, Deuteronomy 16 tells us, and the Haggadah itself tells us, that this is the bread of affliction, halach ma'anya. In other words, matzah is meant to be a poorer form of bread, a reminder of the affliction of slavery and how we ate whatever we could to survive. That makes sense, but why the temple? Why this connection, and why does this offering have to be done as matzah? We don't do it with haste. We don't do it with affliction as far as our temple worship goes. The sacrifices were not supposed to be rushed. No disrespect to Herb or Barry and the alacrity of their Haftorah readings, but service is not something that we're supposed to rush through. And the priests were not supposed to just wolf down their food. And the food itself was certainly not supposed to be of poor quality. In fact, it's just the opposite. The priest always got the choicest cuts of meat and the best fruits and the best grains. So why matzah for the temple offering? Well, the Talmud teaches us something. When Rabbi Alexandri finished his daily prayers, he would say following: Ribono shel olam, sovereign of the world, it is revealed and known to you that our will is to perform your will. And what is it that prevents this? It is the yeast in the dough. I'll explain. In other words, the selfish desires in our hearts leaven us. They puff us up. They fill us with air, in other words. And so, in this metaphor, fully risen bread symbolizes indulgence and laziness and self-gratification. So if bread represents self-desire, then matzah becomes a symbol of restraint, humility, sacrifice maybe, a willingness to live more modestly, to serve God and to serve a higher purpose. Now, our ancestors were forced to survive on the bread of affliction, the bread of poverty. And so once a year, what do? We make do with less, right? And I know there's this whole thing during Passover. It's harder this year to get your hands on it, but there's all this kosher for Passover bread and kosher for Passover cereals and pizza. And to tell you the truth, it tastes pretty horrible. For a week, we a little more simply eat vegetables, eat fruit, eat fish, eat a little bit of chicken, and of course, eat your simple matzah. And it reminds us to not take our freedom for granted, and that ultimately everything we have comes from the Holy One, comes from God. So now, if we take this understanding of matzah and fit it back into the temple service and the mincha offering we just read about, because in the best sense, the priests were supposed to devote themselves fully to divine service, not to self-aggrandizement. And they didn't just eat matzah on Pesach like the rest of us. No, they ate it regularly as an exercise in humility keeping their own desires secondary as they served God and as they served the people. But there is one major exception to this rule. And if you know the exception to this rule, I will invite you to press your space bar and say the one time in the year, the one holiday where the grain offering is different. There's one festival, one time when it's brought fully baked and fully risen. So for 50 points, somebody push your space bar if you know. It's a tough one. I'm going to give you a hint. The holiday serves two purposes. The first one is it celebrates the very first wheat harvest. Does somebody know now? Push your space bar if you do. Okay. Second hint, the other purpose of this holiday is it commemorates the giving and receiving of Torah at Mount Sinai.
Shavuot.
Shavuot. Yes.
Exactly.
Shavuot. Who said that?
Michael.
All right, well, you needed both hints, so I'll give you 25 points instead of 50, but that's still pretty good. Leviticus 23:17 reads, "You shall bring from your settlements 2 loaves of bread as an elevation offering. Each shall be made of 2/10 of a measure of choice flour, baked after leavening as the first fruits to Adonai." Now, why is this grain offered as bread and not matzah? Well, we're thanking God that what we planted in the spring actually grew and produced food. Wow. We're probably pretty grateful and pretty relieved. And what better way to celebrate than making the best thing we possibly can out of that grain, bread. Delicious challah. And, but what about that notion of bread symbolizing our selfishness? How come now we're told to put risen bread on the altar after being specifically commanded not to bake bread with leaven? In all of the other grain offerings, throughout the sacrificial system, all of the other grain offerings are specifically baked into matzah, and certainly not after Passover, Shavuot, following Passover. We've just come from the holiday of Passover, and we're told that this is the bread of affliction and the bread of humility. Well, my dear friend, Rabbi Shlomo Ephraim Lunchitz of 16th century Prague, he's known by his work, the Kli Yakar. And this guy is just, in general, mind-blowing if you can get through what he's talking about. And he gives us another one of his mind-blowing insights as to why Shavuot and the receiving of Torah should invoke a very, very different type of spirit than we had on Pesach. He says that through the sacrifices, a person ought to sacrifice desire. And that's why the mincha offering, as we said earlier, is flat, unleavened, simple matzah. But he goes on to say that the 2 loaves of bread we offer on Shavuot are specifically leavened. They're specifically puffed up, because if it wasn't for this selfish desire, if it wasn't for our yetzer hara, the evil inclination, the desire towards self-fulfillment, if we didn't have that, we wouldn't need the Torah, right? Why do we have the Torah? Because if we were just selfless, perfect angels, we'd be perfect. We wouldn't need Torah to teach us to be better, to bring us along, to mitigate our wants and our desires, right? Because to be complete human beings, we also need the Yetzirah. We need the selfish inclinations. As the Kli Yakar puts it specifically, for without the Yetzirah, a person would never build a house. A person would never marry or have children. But in a place of Torah, we need not worry that we will go too far, for Torah restrains us. Now, what the Kli Yakar is doing here is he's referencing an amazing midrash from Talmud. This midrash says that at a time, all of the righteous people of the world got together and they prayed to God and they said, God, please take away this evil inclination. Take away this Yetzer Ra from our hearts so that we may serve you purely. And God says, you think you know better than me? Sure. And God does grant their wish. God takes away the Yetzer Ra from the world, and it's a total disaster. Why? There's no drive for the self. People, yes, stop building houses. Sheep stopped foaling. Chickens stopped laying eggs, and nothing got done. So on Shavuot, instead of suppressing our desire, we acknowledge it. And we even celebrate our desires. Sure, selfishness can get in the way of divine service, but without it, we'd never do anything meaningful in our lives. Without ambition, who would create? Who would learn? Who would love? Now, Rambam, Maimonides, talks about the golden mean. The golden mean is also an Aristotelian concept. It's a Greek philosophy that says balance is the key. Not too far from one extreme and not too far to the other. Not complete unbridled desire, and certainly not so far where we don't enjoy the pleasures of life. Moderation. So on Passover, matzah should teach us humility. But we're not aesthetes. We're not trying to be so pious that we get lost in a life of self-denial. That's not what Judaism is about. Remembering what it's like to be a slave is certainly important, but actually being a slave, well, that would be tragic. Conversely, the bread of Shavuot should invoke passion. We eat yummy foods, we eat cheesecake, we stay up, we drink coffee, and we eat candy, and we indulge some of our desires because our humanness is why we were given Torah in the first place. Torah is a tool to harness our passions and direct us to use them wisely and compassionately and for good. Desire is essential for growth and accomplishment, but we need to temper our wants or we risk becoming yet another kind of slave, a slave to our desires. The trick is finding Rambam's golden mean. And I'm not quite sure how to do it. That's a work in progress. All of us are figuring that out day by day. And maybe that balance is being sought in another type of sacrifice, also spelled out in our Parsha. We didn't read it today because we didn't read the full Parsha, but it's called the Korban Todah. Korban Todah is a thanksgiving offering. And it says, Im al Todah yikrivenu v'hikriv al zevach hatodah chalot matzot belulot bashemen al chalot lechem chametz. If one brings a Korban Todah, a gratitude offering, it should be brought, now get this, together with the sacrifice of gratitude, matzah, spread with oil, along with loaves of leavened bread. Out of this, a person shall offer one of each kind as a gift to Adonai. Did you catch that? You see, the gratitude offering is very unique. The gratitude offering includes both matzah and fully leavened bread. And it's the only sacrifice that does bring both of these breads. So what's the Torah trying to teach us here? Which side of humanity is being called upon? Is it our humility or is it our passion? As we give thanks, do we recognize our smallness or do we celebrate our greatness? Is the gratitude offering an expression of a Passover mindset where we seek humility and keeping our passions at bay, or is a Shavuot consciousness where we acknowledge and even celebrate our passions and our desires? So which one is it? Yes, both. Both. In being grateful, it's okay to celebrate our personal achievements. It's okay to celebrate our victories, our successes, and the fulfillment of our desires and the good things that we have. But we also need to remember that we can't do any of it without God's help and without the help of others. And so what blessings we do have must be shared with those who don't have. To put matzah and bread together is to become aware that we have everything and yet we have nothing. It demands that we feel at the same time both great and small, rich and poor, free and enslaved, and that, my friends, that is gratitude. Shabbat Shalom, v'chag kasher v'sameach.